So amendment number 10. Go ahead, Senator McDowell. Go ahead. And you're moving it?
I move the amendment. And Fáilte Rivanara Arish Arashka on Chachsha. In January 1998, two wind farm developments from two separate developers, one called Sergos Energy Limited and the other called B9 Energy Limited, were made. Applications were made to Galway County Council for the permission to erect 46 wind turbines on 3 sites in the locality of Derrybrien. And permission was granted to Sergos for 46 turbines in March 1998. And in the same month, B9 Energy Services Limited was granted permission to erect 23 turbines. So that's in all 69 turbines which were to be erected in the area of Derrybrien. Now, local residents then appealed the decisions to An Bord Pleanála, but then the local authority's decision was upheld by An Bord Pleanála, and again in the year 2000, Sergos applied to Galway County Council for a further 25 turbines, and for that would mean that for them it was 71. And initially, Galway County Council refused permission, but on appeal, the developers were granted planning permission for these developments. And in consequence of that, Sergos Limited leased an 850-acre site at Derrybrien, and construction work commenced in October 2003. Now, the next thing that happened, Acirlig, was that there was a peat slide, a landslide of peat, causing environmental damage to the site at Derrybrien when the contractors were constructing the wind farm. And huge amounts of peat were dislodged and slid across the site, polluting a local river, and that resulted in the death of 50,000 fish. Now, the landslide meant that 450,000 tonnes of peat, which is a lot of peat, were spread over an area of 25 hectares, which is 50 acres or more. And that resulted in a huge movement of 250,000 tonnes of material in a downwards direction, downslope. And that disaster led to An Bord Pleanála refusing a substitute consent to the ESB subsidiary, and the wind farm capacity that was now affected by that refusal of substitute consent was 59.5 megawatts, which is a very substantial development, especially when you consider that we have a 5,600 megawatt generation capacity on the island itself. So this was not some small pocket development. This was a substantial one. Now, in October 2004, ESB International and Ascon, who was a construction company, were prosecuted and fined at Gort District Court for allowing polluting matter to enter the headwaters of the river, and derisory fines of €1,250 were imposed on each company. In 2005, the following year, the European Commission announced it was going to prosecute Ireland in the European Court of Justice in respect of these issues. I just want to stop there and say this was most probably as a result of a direct intervention by environmentalist volunteers at European level. And in 2019, the state was fined €5 million over its failure to comply with EU legislation that might have prevented the landslides linked to the construction of a wind farm in 2003. And this fine has since been increased to €17 million. And the fine in question was largely due to the state's failure to carry out an environmental impact assessment on the site, as was required by European law for a development of that kind. And so the ESB then lodged a substitute consent application under the amended planning law through a remedial, environmental impact assessment report in June 2020 to regularise the project's planning status. And later, An Bord Pleanála decided not to grant substitute consent for the development. So what's the situation now? The situation now is that 70 turbines in the Slieve Aughty Mountains, after 20 years of controversy, must be removed. And the site has already cost the Irish taxpayer 17 million euros in fines. And now we're at the stage that all of this badly needed infrastructure has now to be removed in its entirety, and the rather futile obligation is being cast on the ESB and the developers to try and reinstate the site to the state it was in prior to the landslide. In other words, the matter is to be remedied. And the reason that substitute consent was not granted was because it was effectively impossible to do so in the circumstances that I've described. Now, what we're doing in this amendment is to say, okay, but there's a number of things, a number of reflections I would like to put on the record here. I mean, firstly, our planning laws were grossly inadequate insofar as polluting the river ended up with €1,250 fines. I mean, it's virtually TV license stuff, or certainly motoring offence stuff that's involved with. But secondly, the Irish state has had to pony up 17 million euros to the European Union by way of penalties. And instead of having a regime that could have, a statutory regime which could have approached the matter on the basis of redress consisting of the developers having to bear the cost of the fines in question on whatever basis, and secondly, an estimate as to whether the actual demolition of the wind farm and the reinstatement of the site is environmentally justifiable. We now have what I consider, and the movers of this amendment consider to be a wholly unjustified situation, that more damage is going to be done to the environment, valuable resources are going to be wasted, badly needed wind energy is going to be decommissioned and destroyed. All for what purpose? To make a point that at the very beginning an environmental impact assessment should have been carried out. Now, I wonder whether Ireland is unique in this. I wonder whether this would happen in any other European state. I wonder whether the powers that be would not have found some solution to this situation to impose upon the people who made the original mistake of not seeking an environmental impact assessment the burden of remediation while retaining the development. And I wonder about the absence of proportionality that, 20 years after all of this is done, and we're now in 2023, and 2003 was when the work was carried out, that, somebody would actually say, where is the common sense in all of this? Is the environmental tail wagging the environmental dog in the sense that a purist view of this is being allowed to produce a result which flies in the face of what most people would consider to be proportional and common sense. So what does our amendment do? Our amendment amends Section 13 to provide that as part of the process of consideration of a consent, a substitute consent application, that there should be an independent review of the environmental, financial and community impact of the existing development or the decommissioning of the existing development on the lands under consideration. That's not very much to ask. In addition to the retrospective look-back aspect, which is currently enshrined in the law, that somebody should actually look at what the practicalities and the proportionality and the reasonableness of requiring a development to be nullified and reinstatement of the site, insofar as that could ever be done, should be undertaken. I understand that the ministers and his departments in the sad position that they've been advised that there's nothing we can do at this point. We can't go to Europe on our knees and say, look, we've paid our fines, this won't happen again, we've amended the law. But there is a positive environmental advantage in keeping this wind generation facility in place, especially in a country which is making, and I hope the Minister doesn't take this as a barbed political point, slow enough progress in substituting renewable generation for non-renewable fossil fuel sources of energy distribution at a time when we're, according to all of the prognostications, going to fail to meet our 2030 targets. And we're trying to electrify the country. We're trying to drive a revolution in our energy requirements. And here we're in the situation that as a result of a failure to carry out an EIA back in 1999 to 2003, that we are actually destroying alternative energy facilities at great cost. Now, nobody has yet actually put a figure on the cost that there will be in demolishing this facility. I'm not competent to say whether the turbines can be re-erected anywhere else. And nobody's come out clearly and said they can be shifted to somewhere else, and even the mechanical infrastructure can be saved. But I'm deeply skeptical about the environmental sense of attempting to wipe out this facility on the basis of a historic error of this kind. And I do want to put this on the record, I don't believe there was mala fides at any point in the whole process. I don't believe that people said, oh, we have an obligation to do that, but Europe can get lost, we're going to cut a corner here. I don't believe the ESB would do that. I don't believe that the Planning Authority would do that. I don't believe that on board Planola at the time, when it approved these additional facilities, consciously decided to breach European law. And Senator Higgins talks about the necessity of preventing people from just riding roughshod over European law and then benefiting from it. But if it all comes down to, 2 fines of €1,250 and the obligation now cast on, effectively on nationally owned entities, to spend more money demolishing all of this structure, where is the common sense in all of this? What are we trying to achieve? Is Europe trying to say to us, you were very naughty in 2003? On board Planola should have insisted on an EIA back then and shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z, shouldn't have granted the appeals in question. There comes a time in virtually every aspect of human affairs where you can't actually put the toothpaste back in the tube. And that's what this decision of on board Planola and the fact that we can't go to Europe and ask them just to take a common sense view of the matter, that we're stuck now with a statutory outcome by on board Planola, with the destruction of hugely valuable infrastructure and an utterly futile effort to remediate that which I think is irremediable in any event. And just going back to the landslide and all the rest of it, or the turf slide or the bog slide that took place, presumably the developers didn't foresee that that was likely to happen. And presumably, if they had foreseen the risk of that happening, they would have taken steps to prevent it from happening. I don't know what the engineering steps would have had to be, but presumably they would have done their earthworks or their earth removal works or their installation works in a different way, or taken precautions to insert pilings or whatever it was to prevent an event of this kind from happening. But we're now in the utterly ridiculous situation that, having spent 17 million paying penalties to the European Union, we are now destroying extremely valuable infrastructure and pretending, and I make this point, pretending that we're going to remediate that site at whatever cost that's going to fall eventually on the community. So it's in that spirit. I mean, I fully accept the need for EIAs. I don't believe in this case that there was ever a conscious decision to circumvent the requirement for an EIA, and I don't believe that on board Planola would be party or was party to such circumvention. And therefore, it seems to me that in future, in circumstances such as these, we not merely take a look at the wrong that was done, but we also take a look at the extent to which it is proportionate and in conformity with common sense and the good of the environment and the good of the community to take a different course rather than a refusal of a substitute consent. And that whatever steps have to be taken to ensure that in this case, the significant cost to the Irish Exchequer and what is going to be the cost borne by whoever has to pay the bill for attempting to remove all this should be borne not by the community, but should somehow be levied on the profits that would arise from Derrybrien if the wind farms were left intact. So it's in that spirit that I move this amendment.
Senator McDowell, Senator Crockwell, then Senator Higgins. Senator Crockwell.
Minister, you're welcome to the House. I don't intend to go back over what my colleague has so eloquently put together regarding Derrybrien. But I can tell you that I visited the site. I went down and I walked, should I say, I was driven around the site and walked part of it. And with the best will in the world, there is absolutely no way of returning Derrybrien to what it was pre-development. There's just no possibility. There's 25 kilometres of roads in there. There's fibre optic cables running from turbine to turbine. There's an entire information technology system that manages each one of the turbines. Indeed, those who manage and the engineers that look after them can activate a turbine from their home. They don't have to be on site. They can monitor those turbines from the home. 70 turbines, as my colleague Senator McDowell pointed out, producing 1% of the entire electricity needs of the country. The site itself is in pristine condition now. The area where the mudslide took place is totally overgrown and nature has recaptured it. And incidentally, it's not the first bog slide there ever was in this country, and in some cases there was no development taking place. So it is a bit of a nonsense to totally blame the development. The turbines at the moment, they are allowed to turn them on to turn 2 on per day for a short period of time to ensure that they don't seize. I understand that there is interest from as far away as Africa, Denmark, Finland, looking at these turbines, which will ultimately be sold for scrap, because that's all they are. And yet these turbines are almost, I think I was told, 99% efficient when they're running. The area that they're in, for me, makes an ideal nature reserve. It's the sort of place where you could have a greenway while the turbines were active. You could have a nature reserve there. And indeed, what should happen is to prevent turf cutting there in the future. Those who own bogs on the site should be paid an annual sum of maybe 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 a year for the next 10 or 20 years to compensate them for the loss of their turf. The people that I spoke to locally have absolutely no problem with Derrybrien. And I started to think about how we got to where we're at. And the analogy I want to give you is about the bus stop for Corndulla village, which was put together by Transport for Ireland. Made perfect sense. They were going to put a bus stop at this spot on the map until somebody actually walked the distance or drove the distance. It was 10 kilometres from Corndulla. No pensioner was going to walk 10 kilometres to get the bus into Galway. And what happened was you had a decision made at a desk. Nobody went on the ground to see what was happening. Similarly, in Derrybrien, one officer from the planning authorities went on site and was supportive of the site. Nobody else has gone there. The people in Europe who put on the pressure to have this matter considered by the European courts, none of them visited the site. None of them have seen the site. The European Court hasn't come to the site. So nobody actually knows what's going on there. Now, we talk about our planning laws, and that's what this is all about here. I can tell you now, if they attempt to dismantle Derrybrien, I will be the first person to put in an objection under planning, because you cannot remediate. If we take individual turbines, the foundations for those turbines have to go through bog down to hard ground. In some cases, that's several metres. How do you pull out several metres of concrete and replace it with turf? How do you do that? How do you take out 25 kilometres of road and replace it with the turf that used to be there? How do you take out the fibre optic cables? The national grid that is feeding into that site has to be taken out of it. One resident down in Loughrea said to me, we have a hospital in Loughrea, we have a nursing home, and we have a few more nursing homes around the place. Surely to God they could generate the electricity and give it to them for nothing. And I think the amendment that we put forward here addresses some of those issues. And I really do. I spent a lot of time on the European Affairs Committee over the last 7 or 8 years. And you know, there was a lot of talk in Europe about subsidiarity and about trying to bring decision-making back to the local country and things like that. And we get decisions like this. Is there any wonder that people are turned off the European idea when you have bureaucrats in Brussels or Strasbourg or wherever making decisions about something they never saw, based on one environmental incident? And my colleague is right. The fines that were imposed on the contractors at the time was ludicrous, absolutely ridiculous, while the state picks up 17 million of a cost. So I think this amendment makes perfect sense. But my real plea here in standing here today and in seconding this amendment is, would somebody, for God's sake, step back and think about what we're doing? You can't, as my colleague said, put the toothpaste back in the tube. No way on God's earth can Derrybrien ever be returned to where it was. So why not make it a benefit to the nation? We are going through an international energy crisis, and we have 70 turbines down in Derrybrien switched off, sitting there waiting to rust away. It is absolute insanity. And that's why this amendment that we're putting into this bill, and I hope you will accept it, Minister, I think it would make perfect sense and would allow situations like this to be appraised in a much better way. I'll leave it at that for the moment. Go ahead.
Thanks, Senator Crockwell. Senator Higgins.
Very briefly on it, I actually think there's aspects of amendment number 11 that I think are constructive, but I would perhaps suggest that it would be important that it be like with like, so that the idea of an independent review of environmental impacts rather than environmental, financial and community, because once you create a situation whereby a good financial case can outweigh the environmental impact. There is a very compelling, environmental case that was put in terms of you look at one environmental impact alongside another environmental impact. I think that is something to be looked at. But when you add in financial impact, then you suddenly have a creation of a situation where you don't have like with like, but you have a financial benefit, probably a financial benefit to companies, and that's speaking in the generality, as we've heard, they pay the small fines, the state pays the large fines when we fail to deliver on our environmental obligations. That could be outweighing the environmental considerations that we need to. So again, having a wider frame on the environmental considerations, including the impact of decommissioning and how that works, I think that has some merit, but I just note in this that the financial is placed alongside that. And I would note, unfortunately, the thing that makes this frustrating, this isn't, the EU suddenly being unreasonable. This was signalled earlier. It should have been acted upon. And what would make it a lot more convincing for Ireland to make a case such as this in terms of, is if we had shown that we've learned from it. And sadly, unfortunately, the message has been over the last few years, and I've seen it over the last 5 or 6 years, is that Ireland doesn't seem to have learned from it. Despite having this case there, and despite having the absolute waste of energy, of time, of infrastructure, of everything that goes into a project wrongly situated, not planned properly, we have continued to say, could we just save a little bit of time by kind of skipping or getting around those stages quickly? When we know that it makes for a longer and more expensive journey in the long run. And it is a sign that we haven't learned from it, that we're reading in the papers today that on board Planola, bear it in mind, on board Planola, who under this legislation will be dealing with it all on their own, straight up to them, have one ecologist out of their 60 inspectors. So of the 60 inspectors whose advice is not always listened to apparently, anyway, but of those 60 inspectors, only one of them is an ecologist. How could Ireland be paying fines of millions and millions and millions over the last few years and not be thinking, God, maybe we could do with having a lot more ecologists and a lot more staff who can conduct environmental impact assessments so that we don't dig ourselves into these holes in the future. And the fact that Ireland, again, in the European Court of Justice was having to get pushed around the fact that we weren't properly doing environmental impact assessments on peat extraction. Peat extraction when, in an 18-month period of the last couple of years, we saw 1.5 million tonnes of peat exported from Ireland, horticultural peat. And we know that large-scale industrial peat extraction simply wasn't getting proper planning or being subjected to environmental impact assessments. When the EU gave out to us about forestry and the fact that we were failing to do environmental impact assessments on large forestry projects, instead of saying, we will massively, and I acknowledge now that Minister Hackett has slightly increased in that area the numbers of ecologists. It's important, but that's the actual solution, rather than trying to hope that less people will take appeals against it. So again, I actually do sympathise in terms of specific projects being looked at, in terms of the environmental impact and the environmental piece being looked at in the round. I think there is some merit in the kind of idea being put forward as one of the considerations that might be taken into a place. Parts of the language, I think, in Amendment 11. But I also think that sadly, Ireland has not and is not illustrating, and in this legislation is not illustrating that it has learned from this, and that it will not make those mistakes again. And just a last example of how we have not learned from that and making this, it was answered, where am I referencing the law from? I think it was Senator Cummins who asked me about that. And again, or maybe, no, it was Senator Buttimer. And specifically, it was in fact paragraph 57 to 58 of the Commission versus Ireland case 21506, which was the original Derrybrien case, which said that while community law cannot preclude the applicable national rules from allowing in certain cases the regularisation of operations or measures which are unlawful, such a possibility should be subject to the conditions that it does not offer the persons concerned the opportunity to circumvent the community rules or to dispense with applying them, and that it should remain the exception. And again, they highlight that the systems of regularisation under paragraph 58, they highlight that could have the effect, these were the systems then, of encouraging developers to forego ascertaining whether certain projects satisfy criteria for prior assessment. And again, the proposals now, that's why the like with like is important, and if you wanted to bring that in, the public consultation piece, those rights under the Aarhus Convention of the public to be part of environmental decision making. And I'm sure there's lots of the public who like Senator Crockwell, who may well make a very strong case from an environmental decision making perspective that they believe something should be retained sometimes rather than removed and start again. But the key is it has to be a conversation about environment and environmental decision making. And again, this legislation actually truncates the public involvement in that by skipping the local authority stage in respect of associated new developments. And again, it is in that sense a lessening of opportunities for public engagement in respect of environmental decision making. So again, I think these kinds of trying to look at the mistakes of the past and how can we find the best possible way forward would be more convincing if they were actually accompanied by really strong measures that show a sea change, by really strong public involvement in an environmental discussion around situations like Derrybrien and many others. It's actually by strengthening the environmental discussion and indeed widening it that we can actually do more, rather than by yet again truncating it or retrospectively trying to not just retrospectively and into the future, finding ways to smooth out the process.
Thank you, Carol. And I want to welcome the Minister to the House, and I think it's particularly apt that we have Minister Noonan here with his strong credentials in relation to environment. And I too recognise what Senator Higgins talks about, the Aarhus Convention. I'm constantly talking about it in here, and the right of engagement with the citizens on environmental issues. And I don't like using this expression, we are where we are, but I think Senator Crockwell made the point, and indeed Senator McDougall made the point, that this is up, this is there. And it's questionable. There may even be more environmental damage taking it down and taking it away. And at the same time, we have a crisis in relation to energy and the potential here for this. I suppose I'm mindful, I went to see the site myself, and I want to acknowledge the enormous work that Councillor Geraldine Donoghue from Galway County Council, and indeed her colleagues in Galway County Council, because they are deeply concerned. They've had some extensive debate in relation to this issue, and I'd always like to go to the subsidiarity, to apply subsidiarity, go to the ground, meet the people there, meet the public representatives of Galway County Council, and you hear another story, and you hear very rational and reasonable explanations as to the potential of it. And it has been a difficult issue, and people have evolved, and their opinions and views about Derrybrien have evolved over time. But I think the common theme now is that, look, we are where we are, regrettably. Yes, mistakes are made and they shouldn't have happened, and no one should. I think we need to acknowledge that. It's really important. But we are where we are. It has the potential for an amazing set of biodiversity there. The fauna, the plants, the life, things have started to develop and grow there. It is quite an amazing space. And I don't know, Minister, if you've been to Derrybrien, but I'd recommend anyone go there and see how the land has a great ability to rehabilitate itself and revegetate itself, and it's happened down there. And I think, as I said, my view, and I signed up to this with my group of colleagues, we are fiercely committed to it. It isn't unreasonable, and I don't see where you would have a difficulty, Minister, where we talk about, an independent review. It's an independent review, independent of us, independent of politics, experts in the various fields of environmental, financial, and the community impact. And I think that's really, really important to see what we can do. There are ludicrous fines, crazy fines have been spent, long protracted litigation, all sorts of expenses here. And while if we were to start all over again, it wouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't have happened, we are where we are, where we are asking, we feel this is the right course of action. It is to look at an independent assessment of the environmental, and it has to be financial, whether we like it or not. There has to be financial implications of these things too. They've been a huge part of the problem already, but more importantly, the community impact and how that independent review and assessment of audit can be carried out in some sort of meaningful engagement with people, because that's really critically important. And I am constantly in here arguing about the need for public participation in planning and in the environment. And I know, Minister, you're fiercely committed to that too. But I am also aware of your enormous commitment to alternative energy and meeting our targets by 2030. And so I think we have the potential, dare I say, the seed of something great. Maybe it came about the wrong way, but let's stand back. Let's not make crazy, mad decisions, because I don't believe the people of Galway want that. And I think the more people learn and understand about what is Derrybrien, they believe this is the right thing to do. And for that reason, I join with my colleagues in this amendment, because I think it's the right thing to do, and it isn't something we jumped into lightly. And again, I want to acknowledge the councillors in Galway County Council who engaged with us, who communicated with us and expressed their views in relation to Derrybrien. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Boyne. Senator Crockwell, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of points. Senator Higgins made the point that sometimes people are not listened to. The planning officer who visited Derrybrien was highly supportive of the project. That's my understanding. I didn't speak to the lady myself, so I can't be 1000% certain, but my understanding was that that was her view, and that was the view she brought back to her bosses. But nobody was listening, nobody wanted to listen. It was now the environmental impact assessment hadn't been carried out, and that was it. It was bad news, let's not touch it. ESB, the same thing, it's bad news, let's not touch it. My colleague Senator Boyne is correct. Councillor Donoghue invited me to come and look at the site. I went there. I spoke to business people. I spoke to people in Loughrea. I spoke to people in the surrounding area. I can find only 2 people that actually want this shut down. And when we shut it down, I don't think they know what they want to do with it. You can't bring it back to where it was. It cannot be done. Now, at the end of the day, bureaucrats somewhere have sat down and they have looked at the paperwork behind this project, but none of them have visited it. And if we are going to find ourselves subjected to massive fines, out of the 17 million that we paid in fines, surely to God they could have transported a few of them over to have a look at the site before they made a final decision on it. I just think we are being caught in a bureaucratic bind here. It is not always the case that environmental and financial concerns are mutually exclusive. Sometimes they run hand in hand together. And I don't accept the fact that by putting finance in there that we in some way diminish what we're trying to do. At the end of the day, it's about making sure that steps are taken and steps are taken correctly, and that the entire perspective is taken on board. That we don't go down to the micro level, we look at the macro level as well and see what's there. So I have to say, I can find nobody in the west of Ireland who wants anything to happen to Derrybrien other than it to produce electricity, which what it was built for.
Thank you, Senator Crockwell. I don't know if any other senators wanted to contribute, or Senator McDowell, do you want to come in again? Sorry.
Just briefly, in response to what Senator Higgins quoted from the judgment of the European Court of Justice, I mean, I fully accept the proposition you can't have a situation where people benefit from ignoring the law and they get a slap on the wrist and that's it. But I really do think, that there's been a poverty of imagination as to how we should deal with the decision of the European Court of Justice. I really believe that it was possible for us to enact special legislation to deprive the developers of the benefit, to take it into community or national ownership, and to somehow extract any benefit whatsoever from the people who breached the law, and by the same token compensate the community for for the absence of compliance with the law by depriving people of the benefit of it. I mean, I honestly wonder whether anybody sat down and said, can we bring in a special bill, a Derrybrien bill, and say this wind farm is now going to be vested in X or Y. It is going to, the original developers are going to be deprived of the value of their investment. The state or the community or Galway County Council or whoever it is going to be the beneficiary of the commercial value of what has happened, and the destruction of the wind farm can be avoided in this way. I mean, let's be also clear about another thing. The Minister's party is a champion of wind energy, and there are very ambitious programmes for offshore and onshore wind energy. And I think prior to the last election, every member of this House was bombarded with what I consider to be misconceived propaganda against wind farms right across the country. They caused everything from every disease you can imagine, to every psychological trauma that you can imagine, to every damage to flying birds and all the rest of it. And looking at my in-tray on the old on the internet, emails, I got tired of the sort of constant bombardment of what I consider to be misconceived hostility to wind energy. And of course, most of us would prefer to see it all 40 miles out in the Atlantic where we can't see it. Or, of course, most of us would prefer to have it on somebody else's mountains or hills or whatever, or in somebody else's bog, or wherever it may be. But let's remember one thing, that the transformation that is envisaged by 2030 and 2050 is a process where you, to use the old phrase, since I've mentioned toothpaste and tubes, there is, in environmental terms, going to be some damage to the environment. I have no doubt that somebody is going to come up in the next 5 or 10 years and say that valuable migratory routes for this whale or that whale may or may not be endangered by offshore installations. I've no doubt that that's going to happen, and I've no doubt that there are people who find snails and all sorts of lichens and things like that on the sites of virtually anything that is done. And, you know, we can't, you must break eggs to make an omelette. And in terms of the revolution, the radical revolution to which this country has committed itself in respect of energy generation and a transformation in the kind of energy we use and the way in which it is generated, all of that is going to have some environmental consequences. And therefore, you can't have a purist ideological view and say that because a breach of European law took place, there is absolutely nothing that the state can do about it. And I really fancy that if this situation had taken place somewhere in Spain or somewhere in Denmark or somewhere else in Europe, that the legislature would have responded by saying, right, this is a real mess. We've had to, as I say, pony up 17 million euros in fines. The courts have fined the perpetrators a total of €2,500, which is ridiculous. In these circumstances, rather than remediation and rather than a refusal of a substitute consent, there is a legislative route to deprive the developers of what they have done, and at the same time not to just simply fly in the face of common sense by ordering the destruction and the entirely futile project of trying to put back this bogland to the state it was in before the bog slide took place and before the development took place in the first place. So I really do believe, you know, and I hope that somebody is listening to this, that a piece of legislation could be passed now. Could be drafted and could be passed now to say, right, we're not going to knock this down. We're going to dispossess the developers of the benefit of it, and we are going to effectively nationalise or communitise the facilities that are there in order to minimise the disruption of the environment involved in further works at the site, and secondly, to help in the much bigger, broader and more noble cause of reaching our energy targets in a sensible way. So it's in that, I mean, I fully take what Senator Higgins is saying, that we can't reward people and we can't sort of give people a slap on the wrist, and we can't allow people to have the benefit of what they have done. But we are the community, we're still a sovereign state, and the European Court of Justice, I don't believe, would rule it unlawful for us at this stage to say that the community at large now wants to dispossess the developers of their wind turbines and to preserve them in situ on the basis that that's the way to recoup, that's the best way to recoup the damage that has already been done to the environment and the damage that was done to the community by the circumvention, albeit I think innocent, by An Bord Pleanála and others by their failure to demand an EIA. So it's in that spirit, Minister, that I really do believe that there is a way out of this mess. It's not, I mean, there is a European Court of Justice decision. We can't reverse that. There is a Bord Pleanála decision. We can't, there is no appeal from that. Unless somebody could bring a judicial review, which I don't believe is possible. But there is the alternative route, I would say, and maybe I'm not the Attorney General anymore, but I think if I put on my thinking cap as the Attorney General, I think I could draft a piece of legislation which doesn't impose a kind of an Alice in Wonderland piece of nonsense on us, that we destroy infrastructure which we think, as my colleagues have said, nearly everybody thinks should be there and should be generating electricity, just simply to show that we take European law seriously. Thanks.
Senator McDowell, Senator Craughwell, Senator Alice-Mary Higgins, and then Senator Martin Conway.
Thank you, Laska Hirlock. Minister, it's amazing how one's mind works while they're sitting here listening to debate. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the energy cloud that's operating in the northeast of the country at the moment with the assistance of Electricity and a number of other electricity suppliers. The energy cloud operates on the basis that wind turbines produce energy even when it's not required. So in the northeast of the country, they've come together, and what they're providing is free hot water by way of a retrofit to the water heating system of local authority houses in the northeast. And the people who get it are all in social housing. They get a credit on their ESB bill of, I think it's around about €30 a month, for consuming the electricity that has nowhere to go in the middle of the night. Now, what Senator McDowell has said makes absolute perfect sense to me. We have the capacity to generate electricity for 50,000 houses in Derrybrien. We have a nation that is strapped at the moment with rising costs of energy. We have a European energy crisis on our hands. Could we not, as Senator McDowell says, put a piece of legislation in place that would take these turbines into state ownership and provide free electricity to those who need it in this country? We threw out €200 to me and everybody else who didn't need it of our ESB bills. Could we not use the 50,000 houses that we have, the energy coming from 50,000 houses, to provide free electricity to those living in social housing in the Greater Galway area? Would it not make more sense to do that than to tear down something that is working perfectly, that is operating at around about 99% capacity or efficiency all of the time, with an extraordinary crew of engineers that look after it? Not one of them that I met tried to save Derrybrien because they had other areas that they were looking at as well. They just gave me the cold, hard facts as to what was being produced there. So I think Senator McDougall has hit the nail on the head by saying, let's step back from this. Let's see, can we put a bit of legislation together and get it through this House as quickly as possible, and not, A, destroy a perfectly good power generating system, and B, turn what is now already damaged into further damage by trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, as Senator McDougall has said. So I implore you to take on board our amendment, and furthermore to take what has just occurred in this House back to Cabinet and say, guys, can we not sit down and have a look at this? So I'd ask you to do that. Thank you, Minister.
Senator Crowell, Senator Alice Mary Higgins, and then Senator Conway.
No, I mean, I think there is a sense, and certainly in terms of, since it has been the state that has paid the significant fines, that be it in the location or be it perhaps more in the dismantling of the turbines, that the state should be able to take from this. And I do think certainly it's very interesting. I think they're really interesting proposals, and they're imaginative proposals from Senator McDougall. And I certainly think if there was the prospect of nationalisation and community ownership of badly planned developments, that would be an example of a disincentive to poorly planned developments, and would be probably far more effective than, you know, accompanying fast-tracking of development as set out in this bill. That's an example, you know, of a kind of imaginative solution that creates the environment which you hope, which is that it is an absolute exception that environmental standards are not set, and where they are not set, the risk is not carried by the environment or by the public, but the risk is carried by developers in that context. That rather than there being any risk, the risk of benefit and that risk of perverse incentive. So I think it's a really interesting example. I certainly think it's the kind of thing that would encourage many developers to be getting ecologists and environmental impact assessments in as early as possible, if they felt so. So I think it is a really interesting proposal in that regard. I did want to say, however, yes, you don't have to wait till the future. I'm saying it now, Wales migratory patterns do matter. However, that does not mean that you don't do these things. It's a matter of how you do them. Because a Wales migratory pattern by its nature is time-bound. So, for example, that's around at what time of year you're leading off on building and seismic activity and sonar activity, for example. And I would say this as a member of the Climate Committee. We had the advocates from Wind Energy Ireland recently coming into the committee, and they spoke extremely passionately about their desire for there to be more environmental, more ecologists, more environmental impact officers, collected state data in relation to the marine environment in particular, so you don't have every single company going out and having to do a new data set, but that you actually have, you know, national data that can be used, that's useful in terms of our marine habitats, that is there and reliable and can be used. And they also, very interestingly, and this was not prompted by anyone in the committee, this is what they brought to us, is that they actually wanted environmental NGOs to be better resourced, so that there was feedback and that things came in early, and so that they had projects that they could be confident would work, because they are making huge investments. And so, again, that's the message from them, and I do think there's some signs that industry has learned from Derrybrien in that regard. And again, I think the state would be better to start offering that to industry, what they're actually looking for, which is more resources around the environmental impact assessment, more access to appropriate data, rather than potential, the kind of fixes that we've become too used to in Ireland. And again, I'm not speaking specifically to the Derrybrien project now, I'm saying about the possibilities under this legislation, whereby you may well, instead of having two chances to catch a problem at local authority level and Board Planola level, we have a risk now that new projects on adjoining sites attached to any previous projects may only get one chance really to be caught, and that is at on board Planola level, again a board that has one ecologist amongst its 60 inspectors. So again, I think we should actually listen to what the big wind energy producers have told us in the Climate Committee they want to see, which is a better process into the future. Not just a quicker process, but a better process, because that is quicker in the long run.
Senator Martin Conway.
Margaret Cahill, and I came into this debate late, but I've been listening to Senator McDowell. And Minister, I would appeal to you to actually listen to Senator McDowell. He has significant experience in Cabinet, being an AG, and when he speaks about these things, he tends to know what he's talking about. So I think what he's saying makes absolute sense, and maybe you might just reflect on it, because the idea of this chamber, and this chamber has over the years successfully amended many, many pieces of legislation. I'm here over 11 years now, and I remember even in the first Senate, when the government had a whopping majority, Senator Barrett at the time tabled many amendments that the government accepted because they made absolute sense. So listening to Senator McDowell and indeed Senator Boyan and Crockwell and speaking on this issue, I think they make a lot of sense, and I just would appeal to you to maybe reflect and take on board what they're saying, and, you know, I suppose buy into the ethos of what the Shannon Chamber is, which is a chamber that improves legislation and often results in clouds of common sense coming down to situations that may not have had common sense shrouded on it before.
Thank you very much, Senator Conway. If no one else wishes to speak, I'll just bring the Minister in to respond. Thank you so much, Minister.
But before I come back in on the scripted response, just a couple of points. I'll raise just a couple of quick points. And again, Senator McDowell always has a rock of sense, and I think he always makes sensible points. But specifically, I'm not going to make any reference to the case, the Derrybrien case, particularly. You know, it's subject to an ongoing plan and enforcement, and I'm not going to make any give any feedback specifically in relation to it. I suppose just to say that the Irish State is engaging separately with the Commission in relation to the fines, and I think we've had somewhat conflicting approaches from Senator Higgins and Senator McDowell around, and I think that this proposed legislation is being designed to comply with the legal cases referred to by Senator Higgins. Separately as well, I think site remediation on projects like that is it's an enforcement matter as well, which I can't comment on. And again, comments were made by Senator Higgins in relation to other elements that could impact negatively on the environment, such as peat extraction and forestry. You know, I think there is, again, an aside to this, the AG is involved in a review of the Planning and Development Act. Minister O'Brien has initiated a review on Bord Pleanála separately, so those are important processes. And just to note too that any relevant planning authority in a substitute consent case provides a report on a proposal to Bord Pleanála, so the planning authority's views are taken into consideration along with the public's views, and just as well, exceptionality is at the heart of the substitute consent process. So the public are fully involved, and I think Senator Boyan and Senator Higgins raised the issue of the Irish Convention and public participation, and I'd agree. You know, it's something I feel very strongly about, and I think that's something that we should cherish, and I think that's the ability of the public to be involved in such processes is critically important, and the public are fully involved in substitute consent process as per Aarhus. Again, just I suppose the last point I'll make just is specifically in relation to the points that were made, particularly around offshore energy and the impact potentially on biodiversity. And I think development, be it wind energy or whatever it is, can't be at the expense of biodiversity. And that's why we have a maritime area planning bill. That's why we're bringing in marine protected areas, I think it's critically important that one can't be at the expense of the other. But again, I just welcome the contributions of all the senators in relation to this. Specifically then in relation to Amendments 10 and 11 as tabled by Senators McDowell, Rockwell, Mullen, Boyan and Keown, which form part of the same suggested change to the operation of the Act. These proposed amendments to Section 177E concern the application process for substitute consent and seek to include an additional clause to the effect that all applications for substitute consent must be accompanied by an independent review of the environmental, financial and community impact of the existing development or the decommissioning of the existing development on lands under consideration. And while I understand the reasoning behind the proposed amendments, I am opposing them. The suggested clause is superfluous, with sufficient evidence already included as part of the independent planning process administered by An Bord Pleanála and of the various environmental impact reports that already form part of the substitute consent application.
Very much. Senator McDowell, would you like to come back in again? Or?
It is being moved.
So you're moving the amendment and you're pressing the amendment?
Yes.
So the question is that the amendment be made. Those in favour say Tó. Those against say Níl. I believe the question is defeated. Vote all.
Planning and Development Amendment number 2, Bill 2022, Committee Stage Amendment 10, in the name of Senator Michael McDougall. The question is that the amendment be made, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Thaw, Senator Michael McDougall, and Senator George Crockwell, and Neil, Senator Sean Coyne, and Senator Robbie Gallagher. This vote will be conducted electronically. The voting interval is 1 minute starting anish. Result is read out. The result of the vote is Tá 9, Neil 19. One of our members voted incorrectly. Anish, the next